Well, good evening, everybody. It is an absolute pleasure to introduce to you Miss Virginia Cumberbatch, a very dear friend of mine who is based in Austin, Texas, and she is a formidable force. And one of the things that has connected us is, I guess, this work around anti-racism and racial equity. And Virginia, somebody who's won more awards than I can count. But I think one of the things that I truly admire about her is that she really puts her money where her mouth is, in the sense that, it's not just about advocacy for the sake of advocacy, it's about instilling change. And so, as a co founder of Rosa Rebellion, which she's going to share with us a little bit about this evening, I just wanted you to know her the way that I know her. What I'd love to find out from you is, how you got involved in this work and what this work is for you.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Fadzi, for the invitation to join y'all this evening. I will say, I guess, within this context of COVID and quarantine that we're experiencing across the world, it is wonderful to have such technology that can still connect us around these conversations. I would say, I can't really talk about this work or talk about, my contributions to it in any form or landscape without talking about my parents or my grandparents. I mean, I always joke that, some people have a family business and that might be a grocery store, or maybe, everyone's a teacher or everyone's a doctor. And I would say the common thread, the commonality in my family is that of justice work and equity. And while everyone has embodied that in different spaces, in education, through sort of a faith orientation or context, or through the creative arts, that definitely is a part of, I think, our family calling, which is sort of figuring out how do we leverage our resources, our skills, our talents, our interests to bring about shalom, which is a term that my dad uses a lot, which is a Hebrew word that means peace and wholeness. And so what is our role in our community that we're called in at any given moment to bring about peace and bring about wholeness? And so seeing that modeled by my grandparents and my parents, those were the type of questions that oriented my time in college, my sort of first jobs out of college, and then even my grad school experience and research. And where I landed was really understanding the power of story and history to set context about how we do the work. Because how do we know what to dismantle? How do we know what to disrupt if we don't have a firm understanding of how we got here? And then also realizing the power of story as a tool of healing, as a way of building connection, and as a way of empowering voices. I've really recently tried to shift the mentality of, the phrase we always use, which is like, we want to give people a voice. And the truth is we're all born with a voice, but what role can we be in amplifying those voices, elevating those voices that have historically been oppressed, marginalized, silenced? And in some ways, I think we all have a role in being storytellers. And that is has to be intentional. It has to be a choice that we take on as organizations as well as individuals.
I think that's so good in terms of, intentionality, because I think it goes back to this whole notion of, impact versus intent. And, everyone, you'd like to believe everyone has good intentions, but sometimes those intentions can have negative impacts, on people. And I guess breaking down and making people understand that, what we're seeing globally is a result of intergenerational trauma. And so for a lot of people, it's a trigger. It's about representation. When we see the images of George Floyd or, Breonna Taylor and all of those things, what it does for a lot of people of color is it triggers something that we've carried pretty much since we're born. Like you say, the family business. It's like handed down. The legacy of trauma is handed down. As somebody who's you're on the mayor of Austin's task force for systemic racism and institutional bias. And so I'm wondering, for people who find this moment overwhelming, for organizations, what are the first steps for dismantling systemic racial oppression?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, that's not a one size fits all, as we know, right? There's, I wish there was sort of like, and here's a 5-step program on how to dismantle racism. I really do believe the first step, recognition of the trauma. I think for a long time, specifically in America, we have spent 400 years, if not denying, at least ignoring our transgressions and our missteps as a country. And that this isn't just happenstance, right? We've intentionally brought Black people to this country, right, to use as the foundation of capitalism, to dehumanize them. When we think about the indigenous people in our country, right, those are intentional policies and practices that have been put in place to create a hierarchy based on whose life is valued and who isn't. And so where we are today in terms of education, where we are today in terms of what the police force is actually meant to do, is not just something that has come out of the past 5 years, 10 years, it's 400 years in the making. And so we have to take responsibility of those intentional policies and practices as being a mechanism for how those things are performed today. Like the police system, was built to protect white people and white property. So that's embedded, that's ingrained in the way in which we practice policing. It's not that of necessarily protect and serve for everyone. And it's not that necessarily of a community service. It's created this antagonistic dynamic because that's the way that it's always performed. And so for me, we're definitely exploring this even in my work at the University of Texas, is have we actually taken responsibility for the intentional policies, practices, procedures, and just values of that institution, right? Because I think we're really often try to move ourselves towards like collaboration and reconciliation, because those are feel-good things. Like, let's just forget about the past. Let's forget about the fact that we enslaved you for a couple hundred years. Let's forget about the fact that we created laws called, around Jim Crow that kept you from being able to buy homes or get jobs or have access to capital. Let's forget about the fact that we pushed drugs into your neighborhood and locked up a majority of Black and brown men in a part of a generation. Let's forget about that and let's hold hands and let's be unified and let's reconcile. It's like, that's not how human nature works. If we think about that in an interpersonal dynamic, if you offend me as a friend, we can't just move on. We have to admit, acknowledge, recognize that harm, and then figure out the way to rebuild our relationship. And so I think that's why history plays such a powerful piece of this, is that we have to own our history. We've owned it as Black people and people of color because it has created intention for the way we get to navigate America and most of the Western world, right? But has white America owned up to that history? Have our institutions owned up to that history? As a way to create intention for a new understanding of equity, a new understanding of inclusion. So for me, you can't have reconciliation without repentance, without recognition. And I don't think across the board we have done that as a nation. And honestly, as the Western world, when we think about the ways in which colonialism has impacted every part of this world. And so for me, particularly in my work at UT, that's been a lot of my work, as my role is director of equity and community advocacy, which is a part of our Center for Community Engagement. And so a lot of my work has been, we can't just go into these communities who we ignored for 100 years and be like, okay, we're here, the amazing University of Texas, we're here to give resources, we're here to partner. And most of the communities that in Austin have historically been on what we call the East Side, which is primarily where Black and brown people were forced to live. Like, who are you? Why should we trust you? Are you going to acknowledge the fact that you've been complicit in the gentrification and displacement of our communities. So we have to go in and be vulnerable and say, we own this history. We understand we haven't been a good neighbor. We understand we haven't been present. And then we can work to building a rapport and a relationship that allows us to be collaborative. And I think that needs to happen on a national stage and certainly across the world.